The morning I was assigned to the Alpha King's carriage, the fog hadn't yet lifted from the palace courtyard. That should have been my first warning. Fog in Eldenmore didn't behave like fog in other places. It didn't drift or swirl. It settled, thick and deliberate, like something breathing low against the cobblestones. The stable hand said it meant the wolves were restless. The older maid said it meant something had already gone wrong, and the world was simply waiting for the rest of us to catch up. I believed the older maids. My name is Willa, and I had been a palace maid for 3 years without distinction. Not the worst, not the best. I swept corridors that no one walked, polished silver that no one used, and kept my eyes low in every room that mattered. That was the arrangement. Invisible labor in exchange for a roof, 2 meals, and the comfort of being overlooked. For someone like me, being overlooked was a form of safety. The Palace of Ashenvale was not a place where you wanted to be noticed. It was built from gray stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, all sharp towers and narrow windows, as though the architect had been personally opposed to warmth. The inner court was divided by rank so precisely that even the air felt hierarchical. The upper halls smelled of cedar and candle wax, the lower ones of lye soap and damp wool. I lived somewhere in between, in the maid's wing on the second servants' floor, sharing a room with 2 other girls who worked the east corridor. Their names were Petra and Dina. Petra was round-faced and practical, the kind of woman who kept a list of everything she owned and slept without dreaming. Dina was nervous and gentle, always humming something under her breath, always apologizing for things that weren't her fault. I was fond of them both in the quiet, unspoken way that people become fond of those they survive beside. That morning, Petra had shaken me awake before dawn. "They're pulling names," she said, already dressed, her voice carrying that flat tone she used when she was trying not to sound alarmed. For the outer convoy detail, Head Steward Cavis wants warm bodies in the courtyard by the 4th bell. I sat up slowly, the cold floor sharp under my bare feet. Convoy detail for what? The king is traveling to the northern border. She paused, and in that pause I heard everything she didn't say. They need extra hands. Cavis is assigning whoever's available. I was available. I was always available, because I never volunteered for anything that might draw attention, which meant I was never busy enough to be excused from anything that did. By the 4th bell, I was standing in the courtyard with 11 other maids, a groom, and 2 kitchen boys, who looked as confused as I felt. Head Steward Cavis moved down the line with his clipboard, assigning roles in the clipped, effectless tone of a man who viewed people as inventory. Laundry, supply cart, provisions cart. When he reached me, he looked at his list, then at me, then back at the list. Willa Soren. Yes, sir. You're assigned to the king's personal carriage. Attendant post. You'll stand outside the rear step during each stop, assist with the door, and ensure nothing is required of the king that cannot be immediately provided. He moved on before I could respond. I stood very still. The king's personal carriage. Around me, 2 of the other maids exchanged a look I pretended not to see. One of them, a tall girl named Rosen, who worked the Upper East Hall and therefore considered herself above most of us, pressed her lips together in something that wasn't quite sympathy. "Don't do anything stupid," she said quietly as we dispersed to our posts. I didn't ask her what she meant. I already knew. The king's carriage was stationed at the far end of the courtyard, separated from the supply wagons by a deliberate distance that communicated status without requiring a word. It was black lacquered wood, trimmed with dark iron, 4 horses in front, gray, matching, enormous, and a driver's bench elevated high enough that the man sitting on it seemed to exist at a different altitude than the rest of us. I arrived at the rear step as instructed, tucked my hands behind my back, and waited. The convoy preparations took the better part of an hour. Trunks were loaded. Orders were barked across the fog. Somewhere near the gate, A horse shied at something and had to be calmed by a groom who seemed more frightened than the horse. I watched it all from my assigned position and thought about how strange it was. The way an entire apparatus of power could be in visible motion and still feel like it was holding its breath. I was thinking about this when I noticed something. The driver. I had seen the king's usual driver before, an older man named Greaves, white-haired and broad-shouldered, who had driven the palace convoys for longer than I had been alive. He was the kind of man whose presence was itself a form of steadiness. You saw Greaves on the bench and you thought, nothing unusual will happen today. The man on the bench was not Greaves. He was younger, thinner. His coat was the right color, the dark gray of palace staff, but it sat wrong on his shoulders, slightly too large, the sleeves a half-inch too long. He held the reins correctly, loosely, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned how to hold them. But his eyes, when they moved across the courtyard, moved the way a hunter's eyes move, not scanning for obstacles, scanning for exits. I looked away before he could notice me noticing him. My heart was doing something unpleasant. I told myself it meant nothing. Staff changed. Greaves might be unwell, might have been reassigned, might have any number of ordinary reasons for his absence. I was a maid who had been awake since before dawn, standing in cold fog, assigned to a post that made me nervous. I was primed to find things alarming. I looked back. He was already looking at me. Not with the flat indifference that most palace staff offered one another across a courtyard. With something more specific, something that registered my face, filed it away, and then deliberately returned its gaze forward, as though it had never looked at all. My hands, behind my back, tightened around each other. The king emerged at the 7th bell. I had seen Alpha King Adrian before, in the way that palace servants see royalty, in passing, at distance, in the peripheral vision that habit trains you to keep carefully averted. But standing at the rear step of his carriage, I had no peripheral vision to retreat into. He walked across the courtyard with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to wonder whether space would be made for him, and it was. He was taller than I'd registered from afar, broader. His coat was dark, undecorated except for the iron clasp at the collar, and he wore it the way certain men wear authority. Not as a costume, but as a second skin. His hair was dark, slightly disordered by the morning wind, and his face, when it turned briefly in my direction, was expressionless in the way that only controlled people manage to be expressionless. Not empty. Contained. He paused 2 feet from the carriage door. His eyes went to the driver's bench. Something crossed his face. Not alarm, not quite, but a tightening. A recalibration. His gaze stayed on the driver for exactly 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than it needed to be if everything was normal. Then it moved to me. I reached for the carriage door handle, because that was my job, because that was the one thing I had been told to do, and the one thing I could do correctly in this moment. Stop. His voice was quiet. Not raised, the kind of quiet that is its own form of volume. I froze. The Alpha King's gaze moved from my face to the driver's bench and back again, and in that passage of his eyes I saw something I didn't understand but felt immediately in my stomach. A decision being made, a calculation running to its end. He looked directly at me. "Don't step in," he said. "Your driver was replaced." The words were calm, specific, and they landed like a stone dropped into still water, spreading out in every direction at once. I stood with my hand on the door handle and stared at the Alpha King, who was already turning toward the head of the convoy, with the steady, unhurried movement of someone who had just said something that changed everything, and knew it. Behind me, the fog was still settling. Somewhere near the front of the convoy, a horse stamped its foot against the cobblestones. Once, sharp, like a punctuation mark. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And the man on the driver's bench, the one with the hunter's eyes and the coat that didn't fit, turned his head slowly in my direction and smiled. I don't remember deciding to step back from the carriage door. I only remember that my hand was on the handle, and then it wasn't. And the cold iron of it left a faint impression on my palm that I could still feel minutes later, like a burn that hadn't quite happened. My body had understood something before my mind caught up, the way animals understand weather before the clouds arrive. The Alpha King had already moved to the front of the convoy, flanked by 2 of his guards, speaking in low tones to his captain. He didn't look back at me. He had said what he said and stepped away from it, the way powerful men step away from lit fuses, not because they doubt the explosion, but because they already know the radius. Around me, the courtyard continued its organized noise. Trunks were roped down, horses were checked. The kitchen boys hauled the last of the provisions into the supply wagon, with the grunting effort of people who had no idea what had just happened near the black carriage and would not have believed it if told. I stood at the rear step and tried to think clearly. Your driver was replaced, not the driver changed, not Greaves is unwell today, replaced. The word carried weight, deliberate, specific weight. It wasn't an explanation. It was a warning delivered in the fewest possible syllables by a man who clearly did not waste syllables. I looked at the bench again without moving my head, using only my eyes. The man was still there, still holding the reins with that practiced looseness. He had stopped looking at me, which was somehow worse than when he had been looking. A person who watches you is curious. A person who stops watching you has already decided something about you. His coat sleeve shifted as he adjusted his grip, and for just a moment, one moment, I saw the edge of something dark at his wrist. Not a bruise, a marking of some kind, angular and deliberate, the type that doesn't happen by accident. I looked away. My pulse was unreasonably loud in my own ears. Head Steward Cavis appeared at my elbow so suddenly that I nearly stepped sideways into the carriage wheel. The king has requested a configuration change, he said, his voice carrying the clipped neutrality of a man relaying information he found personally inconvenient. You'll ride inside the second support carriage for the first leg of the journey. Attendant post is suspended until the convoy reaches the Mirabel way station. I stared at him. Inside? Inside. He was already moving. Take the left bench. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't open the window panels without permission. He was gone before I could ask what had prompted the change, which I suspected was intentional. Cavis had a gift for delivering information in exactly the quantity that prevented follow-up questions. I gathered the small pack I'd been assigned: spare apron, a folded cloth, a tin of general-purpose salve that palace attendants were always issued for reasons I'd never fully understood, and walked to the second support carriage, a smaller, plainer vehicle that already held 2 other servants, an older woman named Bess, who worked the king's private corridors, and a young man I didn't recognize who sat with his hands on his knees and stared at the floor with the focused blankness of someone trying to exist as little as possible. I understood the impulse. Bess looked at me when I climbed in and settled. She had the kind of face that kept its own counsel, broad, weathered, gray-eyed, and she looked at me the way experienced people look at inexperienced ones who have recently had a narrow escape. "Sit down and keep your hands in your lap," she said, not unkindly. "I know how to ride in a carriage," I said. "That's not what I meant." The convoy began to move before I could ask her what she did mean, the whole long procession of horses and wagons and guards grinding into motion across the courtyard cobblestones, through the main gate, and out into the gray morning beyond the palace walls. The road to the northern border cut through the Ashenvale forest for the first 4 hours, and the forest was the kind of place that discouraged conversation. The trees were old and close together, their canopies blocking what little light the overcast sky offered, and the sound of the wheels changed on the packed dirt road, deeper, more absorbed, as though the ground itself was swallowing the noise. Bess had closed her eyes within the first 20 minutes, either asleep or pretending to be. which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. The young man across from me still stared at the floor. I looked out the narrow window panel. I hadn't opened it, just looked through the glass, and tried to organize my thoughts into something useful. The Alpha King had seen the driver, had recognized, in the same moment I had, that something was wrong. And he had warned me specifically. Not the guards flanking him, not Cavis, not his captain, me. The maid standing at the rear step with her hand on the door. I turned that over carefully. It could mean he had spoken to whoever was nearest, and I had simply been nearest. That was the most ordinary explanation, and I was a firm believer in ordinary explanations. It could mean nothing more than proximity and reflex. But his eyes had moved from the bench to my face and back again before he spoke. He had looked at me, assessed something, then spoken. That was not reflex. That was decision. I pressed my back against the bench and watched the trees move past the window and thought about the marking on the driver's wrist, angular and dark, and the way his smile had arrived precisely when it would be most unsettling, and the way a coat that doesn't fit is either an oversight or a disguise, and there was a significant difference between the two. We stopped at midday, in a clearing the convoy used as a rest point, wide enough for all the vehicles, with a stone water trough for the horses and a flat area where the staff could take a brief meal standing up. It was the kind of stop that wasn't really a stop, more a pause during which everyone was expected to accomplish necessary things quickly and without complaint. I climbed out of the support carriage and moved to the provisions wagon to collect the midday portions. That was one of my listed duties, reassigned or not. Ensure the attending staff were fed during stops. I was filling a cloth with bread and hard cheese when I became aware that I was being watched. Not the driver this time. One of the king's personal guards. A woman, which surprised me, though I wasn't sure why it should, was standing near the tree line. Not eating, not checking equipment, simply standing and looking in my direction with the steady, patient quality of someone who has been told to observe something and intends to do it thoroughly. I did not look directly at her. I took the bread and cheese and went back the way I came. On the way, I passed close enough to the king's carriage that I could hear, through the closed door, the low murmur of voices inside. The king's. Another I didn't recognize. Lower, rougher, with the cadence of someone delivering a report rather than having a conversation. Then one word, spoken clearly enough to reach me despite myself. Replaced. My footsteps slowed without my permission. Confirmed this morning. Greaves is at the palace, unharmed. Whoever is on that bench has been there since before the 4th bell. A pause. Then the king's voice, quiet and exact. How many people noticed? Another pause. One, sir. The maid at the rear step. The voices dropped again, too low to follow, and I made myself walk. Steady, normal, the walk of someone who had heard nothing and was thinking about nothing except bread and cheese, and the length of time until we reached the way station. But my hands, wrapped around the cloth bundle, had gone very still. One. He had said one person noticed, and whatever came after that answer, whatever the king had decided in the silence that followed, I had no way of knowing. I only knew that I had been counted, named, even if not by name. Filed into a calculation I hadn't agreed to enter. The guard by the tree line was still watching me when I reached the support carriage. She didn't look away when I met her eyes by accident. She gave me very slowly a single nod. Deliberate, private, the kind that is meant to be seen by only one person. And then turned back toward the forest as though it had never happened. I climbed back inside and sat down and pressed the bread and cheese into Bess's hands without a word. She took it without opening her eyes. Good, she said quietly. You're learning. The Miravel way station appeared through the trees at dusk, and it was nothing like what the name suggested. I had imagined something modest. A post house, perhaps, with a stable and a fire and somewhere to sleep that wasn't moving. What appeared instead between the tree line and the darkening sky was a compound, low and wide, and built from the same gray stone as the palace, surrounded by a wall just tall enough to mean something. Torches burned at intervals along the top, and the gate was already open when the convoy arrived, which meant someone had been expecting us. Someone had been expecting us for long enough to prepare. I filed that away without knowing yet what to do with it. The convoy came to a stop inside the compound walls in a practice sequence. The king's carriage first, then the guard vehicles, then the support carriages, then the supply wagons. Everyone had a place. Everyone moved to it. I stepped out behind Bess into the cold evening air and stood in the gravel courtyard while the stable hands came forward to take the horses, and the staff began the efficient, joyless work of making camp inside a building rather than outside one. I was watching the king's carriage. More specifically, I was watching the driver's bench. It was empty. Not the driver had climbed down and gone somewhere empty. The seat had a specific absence, the kind that suggests a person did not simply step away, but was no longer part of this scene in a larger sense. The reins were looped neatly over the post. The brake was set, everything in its place, as though the man had completed his task and dissolved. I looked around the courtyard with what I hoped was a casual kind of attention, the looking around of someone new to a place, taking in her surroundings with ordinary curiosity. There were perhaps 30 people in motion. I did not see the driver among them. Willa Soren. I turned. The female guard from the forest clearing was standing 3 feet behind me. Up close, she was younger than I'd thought, perhaps 28, with a sharp jaw and dark eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent years being told to take up less space and had decided at some point to stop complying. She wore the King's Guard insignia on her collar, but carried no visible weapon, which probably meant her weapons were somewhere I couldn't see them. "Come with me," she said. Not unkindly, not like a request either. I came. She led me through a side entrance into the way station's interior, down a corridor that smelled of stone and old wood and lamp oil, and into a small room that served, based on its contents, as something between a storage room and an office. There was a table, 2 chairs, a candle in a holder on the table, and a man standing at the far wall with his back to the door, looking at a map pinned to the stone. The guard closed the door behind me and positioned herself beside it. I stood in the middle of the room and said nothing, because nothing seemed like the correct amount to say. The man at the wall turned around. Alpha King Adrian looked different without the courtyard around him. In the open space of the palace grounds, surrounded by the organized motion of his convoy, he had seemed like a fixed point, something the rest of the world moved in relation to. In this small room, he was simply a man, large and still, with tired eyes and a coat that now hung open at the collar. Not less intimidating. Differently intimidating. He looked at me the same way he had in the courtyard, direct, assessing, without the social performance that most people put between themselves and their attention. "You noticed before I did," he said. I opened my mouth, closed it, found something that qualified as words. "I don't think that's accurate, sir. You had already seen him." I had already seen the bench. A slight distinction in his tone, not correction exactly, clarification. "You had already seen him. There's a difference." He moved to the table and sat on the edge of it, not in the chair but on the surface itself, which for some reason made him seem more rather than less serious. "Tell me what you observed." I was aware of several things at once. That I was a maid being asked for a report by the most powerful alpha in the territory. That the correct response was probably deference and careful minimization, and that he had specifically asked me because he expected something more useful than deference and careful minimization. I told him about the coat, the way it sat on the shoulders, the sleeves too long. The way the eyes moved, not scanning for obstacles but for exits. The smile at the end, timed too precisely to be accidental. And then, because I had started and the threshold had been crossed, I told him about the marking on the wrist. His expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A shift in pressure, almost. The way the air changes before weather. "Describe it," he said. "Angular, dark. 3 lines, I think. Or 4. I only saw it for a moment when his sleeve shifted. I paused. It looked deliberate, like it was meant to be permanent. The guard by the door made a sound, small, controlled, barely a sound at all. And the king's eyes moved to her briefly, before returning to me. "You have good eyes," he said. "I have a habit of watching things I'm not supposed to watch," I said, and then immediately wished I had constructed that sentence differently. Something moved through his expression. Not quite amusement. The ghost of it, perhaps, in a face that seemed largely unacquainted with the full version. "That habit may have been useful today," he said. He stood from the table edge. "You'll be reassigned for the remainder of the journey, not the support carriage. You'll attend the king's carriage directly, inside, not the rear step." I stared at him. "Sir." "The position is practical, not ceremonial." His tone hadn't shifted, but it carried the weight of someone explaining something only once. If the driver was placed by the people I believe placed him, then this convoy has been under observation since before it left the palace. Having someone inside the carriage who is not a guard, who reads situations the way you appear to read them, is useful. I thought about Rawson's voice in the courtyard that morning. "Don't do anything stupid." I thought about Bess. "You're learning." I thought about the marking on the wrist and the smile timed like a punctuation mark, and the way the king had said replaced with the specific gravity of a word being used as a key. "I don't know how to be useful in the way you're describing," I said. It came out more honest than I intended. "You just were," he said simply. "That's sufficient qualification." He moved toward the door, and the guard stepped aside. He paused with his hand on the frame. "What's your name?" "Willa, sir. Willa Soren." He nodded once. Not the guard's nod from the forest clearing, not coded or private, just acknowledgement, and left. The guard lingered for a moment. "My name is Sarah," she said, with the tone of someone offering information they've decided you've earned. "You'll be working near me for the next 2 days. It's easier if we're not strangers." "What happens in 2 days?" I asked. "We reach the northern border." She opened the door. "And we find out whether what happened with the driver was an opening move or the whole plan." She said it the way people say things that are terrifying but true, which is the way people who operate in dangerous situations have learned to say terrifying true things, plainly, without decoration, as a form of respect for the reality of them. I followed her out into the corridor. That night, the way station settled into its version of quiet. Fires banked, horses stabled, guards rotating on the wall. I was given a small room off the main corridor, separate from the other maids, which communicated my changed status more clearly than any formal announcement. Petra and Dina would be in the shared servants' quarters. I was somewhere else now. I lay on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the morning, which felt as though it had happened to someone else, and also, simultaneously, as though every detail of it was carved permanently into the inside of my skull. "Don't step in. Your driver was replaced. 7 words. And they had pulled me out of the category of invisible servant and placed me, without my request or preparation, into something I didn't have a name for yet, something that had the shape of danger and the texture of purpose. I pressed my palm flat against the rough wool blanket and felt the woven pattern of it under my fingertips and thought, I am the same person I was this morning. My hands were the same. My plain face, my pale hair, my 3 years of unremarkable service. None of that had changed, but I had been counted. And something in me, the part that had spent 3 years practicing invisibility as a survival strategy, understood, with the quiet certainty of a truth arriving, rather than being reasoned into, that the strategy had just become obsolete. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought no dreams. Only the sound of the forest beyond the way station wall, and somewhere in it, moving through the dark trees with no sound at all, something that was not a deer and not a wolf, and had no intention of being identified before it was ready. I woke at the third night bell to the sound of a door, somewhere in the corridor, closing with deliberate softness, and lay completely still, listening to the silence after it. I did not go back to sleep. I lay still for another 10 minutes, counting the silence the way you count seconds after lightning, waiting to measure the distance between the sound and what it meant. The corridor outside my door had gone completely quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of sound but presence of held breath. And I had learned enough in one day to know the difference. At the end of those 10 minutes, I got up. I didn't light the candle. I dressed in the dark. Apron, boots, the plain gray of palace service that made me look like a shadow in most lighting conditions, which tonight felt less like a limitation and more like an advantage. I pressed my ear to the door first, the old wood cool against my cheek, and listened. Nothing. Then I opened it. The corridor was empty in both directions, lit by a single torch at the far end that threw more shadow than light. The way station at this hour had the specific quality of a place that was simultaneously sleeping and not sleeping. Guards awake on the walls, but the interior life of it suspended, all its secrets temporarily unattended. I moved toward the sound I'd heard. Left, toward the station's east wing, where the king's assigned rooms were. Not because I had been told to go there. Because a door closing softly in the middle of the night in a corridor where someone had already tried to replace the king's driver was not a sound I could unhear and return to sleep behind. I was perhaps halfway down the corridor when I smelled it. Not smoke, not exactly. More the ghost of smoke, the memory of something recently extinguished. Underneath it, something sharper, chemical and deliberate. I stopped walking. The smell was coming from a narrow door set into the wall on the right. A service access, the kind found in every palace building I'd ever worked in, used for moving linens and coal and anything else that needed to travel invisibly through a structure. It was slightly ajar. Through the gap, the smell was stronger. I pushed it open with my fingertips. Inside was a service passage, barely wide enough for one person, with a low ceiling and a stone floor. And on the floor, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his head tipped back, was a man I recognized after a disoriented moment as one of the king's attending staff, a young man named Court, who had ridden in the second supply wagon and whose primary function, as far as I understood it, was managing the king's correspondence during travel. He was alive, breathing. I could see the slow rise of his chest. But he was deeply, unnaturally asleep, with the slack boneless quality of someone who had not chosen sleep so much as been chosen by it. On the floor beside him was an overturned vial, small and dark, with a stopper lying several inches away. I crouched down and looked at it without touching it, and the smell coming off the spilled liquid was the same sharp chemical ghost I'd caught in the corridor. Whatever it was, it worked quickly. Court had been carrying something. I could see the edge of a folded paper beneath his hand, pinned there by the dead weight of his arm. I stood up and stepped back into the corridor and stood very still, processing. Court managed the king's correspondence. Someone had removed him from his duties without removing him from the building, which suggested they needed something he had access to. The paper under his hand, almost certainly, and had needed it quietly, without raising an alarm that a missing person would create. Elegant, in a terrible way. He would wake in a few hours with a headache and a gap in his memory and no idea how much time had passed. I went to find Sarah. She opened her door before I finished knocking, which told me she had also been awake. She took in my face, then listened to what I said without interrupting, which I was grateful for. When I finished, she was already moving, pulling on her jacket, her expression doing the thing I was beginning to recognize as her version of urgency. Not panic, just acceleration, everything in her becoming more efficient and more compact. "Show me," she said. I showed her. She crouched over Court for 30 seconds, checked the vial without touching it, looked at the paper under his hand, and then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read entirely, but that contained, somewhere in it, a revised estimation. "You need to come with me," she said. "Where?" "To the king." Adrian was awake. This did not surprise me as much as it might have an hour ago. He was seated at the table in his room with the map from the wall now spread across the surface, a candle burning at each corner, and the look of a man who had been working through a problem for some time. When Sarah opened the door, and I followed her in, he looked up without the flinch of someone startled, only the steady reorientation of someone shifting from one set of information to another. Sarah reported. Concise and precise, the way people who work in dangerous proximity to important people learn to be. She said what I had found, and what we had observed, and what she believed it indicated. When she finished, the king looked at me. "You heard the door?" he said. "Yes, sir." And got up to investigate, alone. The way he said it wasn't quite a reprimand and wasn't quite admiration, existing somewhere in the space between those two things that is occupied by genuine assessment. "I didn't think," I started. "No," he said. "You did think. That's the issue." Something in his tone shifted, marginally. "Most people in your position would have decided it was nothing and gone back to sleep. You got up. That's a choice, not an instinct. I didn't know what to do with that, so I stood quietly and let it be." He looked back at the map. "They want the northern border documents. Court was carrying the preliminary agreements, terms that haven't been made public yet. If those reach the wrong hands before we arrive, the summit is compromised before it begins." He traced a line on the map with one finger, a road that wound up through the higher elevation. "We leave earlier than planned. 4th bell, not 6th. "The staff won't be ready," Sarah said. "The staff will adapt." He looked up at her. "Find out who else was in that corridor tonight," quietly. Then, to me, "You'll remain in the carriage. Not as attendant. As—" He paused, and I had the odd impression of a man who rarely encountered gaps in his own vocabulary. "Witness. Someone who notices things that trained eyes overlook, because trained eyes know what they're looking for." "I'm a maid," I said, not as protest but as clarification, because it seemed important that we both had accurate information. "I'm aware of what you are," he said. And somehow that sentence, completely plain and stated without particular weight, settled something in the room. Not dismissal. Recognition of a fact that didn't reduce the other facts around it. He returned to the map. "Go rest. An hour if you can. We move early." I did not rest for an hour. I sat on the edge of my cot and turned the day over in my mind like a stone in my hands, feeling the edges of it. The fog that morning. Greaves's absence. The driver's smile. The smell in the corridor. Court on the floor with a paper pinned beneath his unconscious hand. And Adrian's voice, quiet in a small room. "You did think. That's the choice. 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of swept corridors and polished silver and eyes kept carefully low, and in a single day, I had been noticed, repositioned, summoned, consulted. Not because I had done anything heroic. I had stood at a carriage door and been too anxious to stop paying attention. I had woken at a sound I couldn't explain, and been too restless to ignore it. My supposed defects, the watchfulness that made me poor company at meals, the anxiety that kept me awake at night, the habit of observing people who weren't observing me, had each found, in this single strange day, an exact and specific use. I thought about that for a long time. When I finally lay down, the candle had burned to a stub, and through the narrow window the sky was shifting from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn. Somewhere in the way station, I heard Sarah's footsteps in the corridor. Efficient, unhurried, moving from door to door in the patient work of finding out what needed to be found out. I closed my eyes. And in the last moments before sleep took me, a thought arrived that I hadn't invited but couldn't send back. That the man on the driver's bench had smiled at precisely the moment I noticed the marking on his wrist, which meant he had noticed me noticing, which meant he had assessed me, just as I had assessed him, which meant someone, somewhere, already knew my face. The dawn was still an hour away when the fourth bell rang through the waystation walls, and I was already awake, already dressed, already standing at the door. Ready, for the first time in 3 years, without knowing exactly what I was ready for. The road to the northern border climbed, not dramatically, not the sudden theatrical rise of mountains and stories, but steadily, the kind of climb that announces itself in the legs and the lungs before the eyes register it, the trees thinning gradually, the sky opening in increments, the temperature dropping by degrees so small you only notice the sum of them an hour later, when you realized you were cold in a way you hadn't been before. I sat inside the king's carriage and watched the landscape change through the window and tried to look like someone whose presence here was unremarkable. The carriage held 3 people, Adrian, Sarah, and me. A new driver had been installed before dawn, a guard named Holt, who Sarah had vouched for with the specific economy of someone who doesn't vouch for people lightly. The atmosphere inside the carriage was not tense exactly, but it was concentrated, the way the air feels in a room where important people are thinking important thoughts and have temporarily suspended the performance of being comfortable. Adrian had the border documents spread across his knee, Court's papers, recovered carefully from beneath his hand. Court himself was awake, bewildered, and had been placed in the support carriage with Bess, who had accepted this development with the same unreadable steadiness she applied to everything. The vial had been wrapped and secured. The corridor had been examined. Whoever had administered the sedative had left no other trace. "The marking you described," Adrian said, without looking up from the documents. I straightened slightly. "Yes, sir. 3 lines, angular, dark, positioned at the inner wrist." He turned a page. "That's the registration mark of the Veil Network, a courier system that operates outside sanctioned channels. Information, occasionally other things. They don't usually involve themselves in political disruption. They're paid to move things, not to take sides." "Someone paid them to take a side," Sarah said. "Someone paid them to move something," Adrian corrected. "The driver wasn't there to harm anyone. He was there to observe, to confirm the documents were on the convoy and identify who carried them." He paused. "Which means there's a second stage. Someone waiting for the report he never delivered." The carriage moved through a section of road where the trees pressed close on both sides, and the light inside dimmed briefly. I watched the shadow pass across Adrian's face and thought about second stages and waiting, and the particular patience of people who plan in layers. "They'll know it failed," I said. Both of them looked at me. I kept my voice even. "If the driver was meant to send a report and didn't, whoever is waiting will know something went wrong. They'll adjust." I pressed my hands flat against my knees. "The summit is in 2 days. Whatever the second stage was, they'll accelerate it." The silence that followed was the kind that means someone has said something that was already known and needed to be said aloud anyway, to make it real and therefore actionable. Adrian looked at me steadily. "Yes," he said. "They will." We reached the northern border settlement by midday. It was called Varen, and it existed at the precise edge of the Alpha King's territory. Not a town exactly, more an accumulation of purpose. A garrison, a meeting hall, a handful of permanent buildings surrounded by temporary structures that went up and came down in rhythm with the summits and negotiations that had defined this border for a generation. The people who lived there permanently had the particular quality of people accustomed to being adjacent to history, without being consulted about it. The convoy was met at the settlement's outer boundary by a delegation. 3 representatives from the northern clans, formally dressed in the dark furs and iron-worked leather of their tradition, with the careful faces of people who were prepared to be either welcomed or insulted, and intended to respond appropriately to either. I watched from the carriage window as Adrian descended and met them. He was, I realized, watching him from this new proximity that the last 2 days had given me, extraordinarily good at this. Not in the performed way of politicians, no warmth manufactured for the occasion, no calculated smile. He simply directed his full attention at the people in front of him, and his full attention was, apparently, something that most people found both rare and disarming. The lead representative, a large man with a gray-streaked beard and the posture of someone unaccustomed to deferring, visibly recalibrated within the first 30 seconds of the exchange. Sarah appeared at the carriage door. "Come," she said. "Stay close. Don't separate from my sight line." I came. The meeting hall smelled of pine resin and old smoke, and it held, by the time the afternoon session began, approximately 40 people representing 6 different interests and at least 3 different definitions of what the word agreement meant. I stood along the rear wall with the attending staff, holding nothing, doing nothing, being exactly as invisible as I knew how to be, which was very invisible. Invisible enough to notice, an hour into the proceedings, that one of the northern delegation's attending staff, a woman positioned against the opposite wall, plain-faced and still in the way of someone trained to stillness, was not watching the negotiation. She was watching Adrian, not with the attention of someone monitoring a political superior, with the focused, patient attention of someone waiting for a specific moment. Her right hand, resting at her side, held a small object I couldn't identify from across the room. Cylindrical. Dark. My pulse did the thing it had been doing since yesterday morning. The loud, inconvenient thing. And I looked at Sarah, who was positioned 6 feet to my left, and was, I could see, already watching the same woman with the steady convergence of someone whose suspicion had just been confirmed. Our eyes met. Sarah's chin moved, a fractional thing. Not quite a nod. More a permission. I moved. Not toward the woman. Toward the side wall, then forward along it, using the crowd of standing attendants as cover. Moving the way I had moved through 3 years of palace service, with the apologetic self-effacement of someone who is always slightly in the way and knows it and is trying to correct it. No one watched me. No one ever watched me. I reached the far corner, angled toward her, and said, in a voice pitched low and domestic and unthreatening, "Excuse me. Steward Cavis asked if you might step out briefly. The provisions carriage needs an inventory signature." It was entirely fabricated. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark and quick, and for a moment I saw the same hunter's assessment I had seen on the driver's bench. The rapid evaluation of a threat and a calculation of response. Then her gaze moved to the room, to the distance between herself and Adrian, to the disruption that causing a scene would introduce, to the fact that I was a small, pale-haired maid with an apron and an entirely unremarkable face. She made the wrong calculation. She stepped out. Sarah was in the corridor before us. I will not describe in detail what happened next, because I was asked to wait by the exterior door, and I did, and because some things are not mine to narrate. What I can say is that the cylindrical object was a compressed air delivery mechanism, the kind used to administer substances at range without physical contact. And the substance inside it was confirmed by the time evening fell to be the same compound used on court. Not a weapon for ending things, a weapon for interrupting them. Someone had wanted Adrian incapacitated during the summit negotiations, creating a window for the documents to be interpreted, signed or sabotaged by someone else in his name. Sarah told me this in the corridor while the garrison's security staff managed the rest, her voice carrying the flat precision of a report being filed even in conversation. "You moved at the right time," she said. "I guessed," I said. Good guesses at the right time are most of what keeps people alive. She looked at me directly. That's not an insult. I knew it wasn't. Adrian found me at dusk, sitting on the exterior steps of the meeting hall, watching the border settlement's lights come on one by one against the darkening sky. He sat beside me, which surprised me enough that I went completely still for a moment, the way animals go still when something larger than expected appears in their peripheral vision. He didn't say anything immediately. We sat in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was the most surprising part. The summit will proceed tomorrow, he said finally. The northern representatives have been informed of what was attempted. They're, a pause with texture in it, motivated to sign. Good, I said, and meant it simply. He turned his head and looked at me in the way he had in that small room at the way station, directly, without social buffer, with the quality of attention that was its own form of honesty. You were afraid, he said, in that room, when you moved toward her. Not a question. Yes, I said, but you moved anyway. It seemed more important than the fear. He looked back at the lights. Something in his profile, in the set of his jaw against the darkening sky, carried a tiredness that had nothing to do with the day's hours, the older kind, the kind that accumulates. I've been surrounded by trained people my entire life, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, the precise authority of it giving way to something that sat lower and quieter beneath it. People who know exactly what to do in every situation I might face. It is... He paused, and I had the sense again of a man unused to reaching for words like these. A specific kind of loneliness. I understood that, in my bones, in the way that people understand things that mirror their own experience so precisely, it almost hurts. To be useful in a way no one trained you for, I said carefully, means no one planned for you, which means you're genuinely there. I looked at the lights. Not placed. A silence. Yes, he said quietly. Exactly that. The summit concluded the following afternoon with signatures and firm handshakes and the cautious relief of people who had been prepared for things to go wrong and found, improbably, that they hadn't. We rode back toward Ashenvale over 3 days, through the thinning forest and the returning fog, and the familiar roads that felt, inexplicably, different from the ones we had traveled out. On the last evening before the palace, Adrian called me to the carriage. Not to report. Not to identify something or notice something or perform the strange sideways usefulness I had apparently stumbled into. He asked me what I wanted. I sat across from him in the moving carriage, with the lamplight between us and the darkening countryside outside the windows, and took that question seriously, because it deserved seriousness. I want work that uses what I actually am, I said. Not work that requires me to be invisible. He looked at me for a long moment. I'm creating a position, he said. Intelligence liaison, civilian-facing. Someone who moves through spaces that guards can't move through without changing the nature of those spaces. Who notices what trained eyes filter out. A pause. It requires someone who is afraid of the right things and not paralyzed by any of them. That's a very specific description, I said. It's a very specific position. I looked at him across the lamplight, at the tiredness in his face that I now understood as something more than fatigue, and at the way his attention, when it landed on me, had the quality of something not often given. Yes, I said. I'll do it. That was 3 years ago. Greaves retired the following spring, and his replacement was chosen by a joint recommendation process that Sarah oversaw and that I was consulted on, which still makes me quietly startled when I think about it. Court recovered fully, and now coordinates the correspondence division with an energy that I suspect is partly motivated by the desire to never be found unconscious in a service passage again. The Vile network was formally warned through diplomatic channels. They withdrew their services from the party that had hired them, and sent, in a gesture I found equal parts bizarre and pragmatic, A written apology to the palace. Sarah and I have worked together long enough that we've stopped needing to explain things to each other, which is the closest thing to fluency I know in another person. And Adrian is not an easy man. He is exacting and sometimes remote and carries his responsibilities the way the old stone of his palace carries cold, all the way through, not just on the surface. But he is also the man who sat beside me on exterior steps at dusk and said loneliness out loud to another person, which I think cost him something, and which I have never treated carelessly. We have built something that doesn't have a common name, which seems right for two people who arrived at each other through uncommon means. There is trust in it, deep and tested. There is the particular warmth of being genuinely known by someone who sees clearly and chooses to remain. On quiet evenings in the palace, when the work is done and the corridors are still, there is something that I will call, simply and finally, home. I think about the fog sometimes. The morning I stood in the courtyard with cold iron under my hand, and 7 words changing the shape of my life before I understood what was happening. I was invisible for 3 years. Then someone looked directly at me and said, "I see what you are, and it matters." I have not been invisible since. The Palace of Ashenvale still absorbs light rather than reflecting it. All sharp towers and narrow windows, built by someone opposed to warmth. But there are rooms inside it now that I know by heart. Their sounds, their smells, the particular quality of their silence. Rooms that hold between their gray stone walls something the architect didn't design and couldn't have anticipated. A pale-haired maid, who noticed the wrong thing at the wrong moment and refused, against all training and habit and the long practice of smallness, to look away. And a king who, for the first time in a long time, felt genuinely found. That is where the story ends. Not with trumpets, not with declarations in great halls, with lamplight and honest work, and 2 people who chose each other in full knowledge of what that meant. With belonging, finally, not given, not inherited, not performed, earned.